Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I realize that we're spread across the world for today's event. My name is Ben Hopkins, and I'm the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs here in Washington, D.C. It's my great privilege and honor to welcome a fantastic panel today for our monthly New Books in Asian Studies series. We're returning to the theme and issue of the frontier and borders today with Kyle Gardner, who's going to talk about his recently hot off the presses book from Cambridge University Press, along with a fantastic panel including Bérénice Guyot-Réchard, who's a professor at King's in London, and some comments as well by Dean Alyssa Ayres, the new dean for the Elliott School. Before we get there, just a couple of housekeeping things. This session is being recorded, so it will be available online for those of you that would like to watch it in future. We do encourage that this be a give and take session with Q&A from the audience, so please go ahead and put in any questions, comments, or insights you might have into the chat box, which you will find on the right-hand side of your panel. There's actually a Q&A box within that. If you can please state your name and list any affiliation there, we will be sure and include as many of those in our discussion today as we possibly can. I should also say that the way we've organized it is after my opening remarks and the deans, then we're going to have really a discussion back and forth between Kyle and Bérénice to get into the meat of the issue. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce today's participants and panelists. Kyle J. Gardner is today's author of The Frontier Complex. I've known Kyle for years and have learned an enormous amount from Kyle, and so it's a real great privilege to welcome not only a colleague and friend this morning. Kyle's book is a really fantastic work that has significance not only across time, so it's a historical work of contemporary relevance, but also across space. Some of the arguments that I think he's going to clarify here about the Sino-Indian frontier and the high Himalaya really are transferable to other places in the world. He's joined today by Bérénice Guyot-Réchard, who is a professor at King's College London, another frontier expert whose own work on the northeast of India has been lauded by all who've ever encountered it, and justly so. Bérénice, likewise, is an old friend whom I have learned an enormous amount from, and I expect that we're going to have a lively discussion between these two that really will illuminate some fantastic issues with that. But before I turn over to those two panelists, let me introduce our relatively new dean at the Elliott School, Dean Alyssa Ayres, who herself is a cultural historian of South Asia, coming from Kyle's alma mater of University of Chicago. We welcomed Dean Ayres at the beginning of February and have been extraordinarily lucky to enjoy her leadership since and moving forward. And so we're very excited for that. If you look at the back of the book, which I certainly hope you all will when you get your own copy, which I will speak about in a minute, you will notice that Dean Ayres has kindly included an endorsement on the jacket for Kyle. And so she is well familiar with this work and also has a professional linkage with Kyle from her time at McClarty, where Kyle is presently. The last thing I want to say before turning it over to Dean Ayres is twofold on the book. Number one, as we've done in the past with our New Books in Asian Studies, we will be having the book giveaway. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A, and that automatically enters you into our book giveaway. We'll contact the winner of this giveaway after the event. And in addition to that, on the Sigur Center invite page, there is a discount code for those of you that don't win the book today. And so I would really strongly endorse using that to get an Easter come Passover come, we're in the middle of COVID still, and I need something more to read, gift to yourself, your family, and all your friends, because it's definitely well worth it. I've talked enough. Let me please turn it over to Dean Ayres, that I'd like to welcome on behalf of the Sigur Center for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. I love the idea of the book giveaway, so let me just encourage everyone to take advantage of that. As Professor Hopkins mentioned, I am the very, very new dean here at the Elliott School. I think I'm in the middle of my 8th week. And indeed, as a scholar practitioner also focused on South Asia, it does bring me great pleasure to be able to help celebrate the publication of Sigur Center non-resident fellow Dr. Kyle Gardner's new book, The Frontier Complex. Here's my copy, Geopolitics in the Making of the India-China Border, 1846 to 1962. And I would also like to note that it is an extra pleasure to celebrate Dr. Gardner's book because he is my former colleague at McLarty Associates. I think that fact shows how historians can work across sectors and bring their regional and domain expertise to bear on all kinds of contemporary questions. But let me say a few words about Dr. Gardner in this book. Dr. Gardner is an outstanding historian trained at Chicago, and he's very comfortable working across different archives and sources in multiple languages, including Ladakhi. Now, I don't want to give away the story here because you're going to want to listen closely to what he'll present this morning, but I had the wonderful opportunity to read the book in manuscript last year, and I just found it fascinating. He pulls together these multiple sources to cast light on the history of the border region between India and China in Ladakh, and even more specifically, the history of border making practices in this area, including approaches to surveying and concepts and principles of the watershed as a natural border. So in some sense, it's also a history of science and technology of cartography. One of his most significant findings locates the origins of today's ambiguities about this border in precisely these earlier colonial cartographic practices. Now, it is not always the case that labors of scholarly love that are years in the making end up in the headlines. But last year, the armed standoff in this border region of Ladakh led to the first casualty in 40 years. And Indian and Chinese troops have been in a standoff for nearly a year. They've de-escalated from one area of tension along this border area, Pangong Lake, but others remain. Suddenly, the theoretical questions Dr. Gardner delves into, questions about how we understand borders, what territorial precision in borders has historically meant in this area, and how the concept of the border has been utilized by states. Suddenly, these questions have had immediate and urgent application. So the frontier complex is a perfect example of careful historical work that helps us understand a front burner geopolitical dispute. And it's why I believe this book will become an essential read on the India-China border. So let me congratulate Dr. Gardner on the frontier complex. I will turn things back over to Professor Hopkins. You are all in for a treat this morning with the conversation you are about to have. And I'm so happy that the Sigur Center is home to precisely this kind of careful scholarship with resonance for today's issues. Thank you. Back over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Dean Ayers, and words for Kyle, which are well deserved. I'd also note we do have good balance on the panel today. We have 2 Chicagoans and 2 Cambridgeites, so we even each other out. But enough of me. Let's get to the main event here, and I will turn it over to Kyle and Bérénice for what I can guarantee you is going to be a fantastic discussion. My last comment to the audience is, please, as this is going on, any comments, questions, insights you have, just dump them into the Q&A, and as we progress through the hour, we'll be sure and integrate those into our discussion. Kyle, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Ben and Alyssa, for those very kind introductions. Congratulations to Alyssa, not just on the position, but congrats to the Elliott School on getting a fantastic new dean. Ben, congratulations on the pandemic beard. I think without further ado, I will pass the baton to Bérénice to kick us off.
Thank you, everyone. I think that this is a great way to get started. Both Alyssa and Ben referred to the fact that their relationship with Kyle goes back quite a long way, and I'm afraid I will continue that chorus. Academia is nothing if not a small world. I can't actually really remember when Kyle and I met. I think it was when we were at the start of a PhD, so quite a long time ago. And I remember at the time working on the Himalayas, in my case, on the other extremity, on the eastern side, which, believe it or not, is several thousand kilometers away, and feeling really lonely because at the time there was very little historical work on that region, let alone on the wider Himalayas. Meeting Kyle with his astonishing knowledge and experience of living in these regions and now researching them through historical sources felt like meeting a kindred spirit in a very cold world. And I have to say, things have changed for the better since we started this research. I think now we can really say, I think you'll agree, Carl, that really research into the historical Himalayas, which used to be seen as a ahistorical place, a place out of time, partly because it was on the edges of empire, that has changed tremendously. We've seen a huge amount of really exciting research. And I have to say, your work really, I think, will be something that establishes the Himalayas as absolutely an objective study in its own right, that historians, not just of South Asia, but of China-India relations, of Inner Asia, and indeed, as your book shows, of the history of science, will really have to pay more attention to than I think has been the case. So I think your book is really a sort of a rallying call, something how I see it. So what is the book about? Dean Ayers gestured at its importance already. If I were to give a few words about how I approached it, I think this is really, it's hard to reduce this book to one narrative. At one level, it's a book about how the Himalayas became British. So it's a book that's focused on the 19th and 20th century, specifically on the northwestern section of this mountain range. But what is really important in this story of colonial expansion is that Dr. Gardner, at every point in the book, reminds us that this is not a blank space that the British are expanding into, which is sometimes how they saw it themselves. It's a really rich cross-border, a really rich crossroad of cultures, of trade, of interaction. The people who live in it have invested it with layers upon layers of political, religious, social meaning. And the fact that colonialism barges into this region represents a moment, I wouldn't say a rupture, because one thing that Dr. Carl Gardner does is to really push away from the idea of watersheds actually in history, as in watersheds as a way we say, well, this was before and this was after. He thinks of watershed in a different way. Instead, what the book really shows is the sort of the really multi-layered, really long-winded process by which this region was taken under control, and never completely so, by a variety of British actors, colonial actors, from surveyors to military strategists to geographers to scientists, etc. And so the second aspect of the book that is absolutely fascinating is also that it tells us about the processes by which a place, in this case the Northwestern Himalayas, become objectified in order to be controlled, or controlled to some extent also in order to be objectified, and the sort of circular loop between the two. And so I would say, again, as a push for you all to buy the book, that there's really, I think, something in this book for everyone. If you're interested in the Himalayas and in Sino-Indian relations, you've got extraordinary background on the Himalayas in their own right over the long period of history, but also on more recent issues. If you're interested in colonial conquests and mechanisms of control, including how fragile they can be, it's there for you. If you're interested in frontier spaces, in continuing the conversation that Professor Hopkins began with, or rather is continuing with his recent book, you've got it there. If science and geography is what really, really passionate, makes you passionate, you've got it as well, because it's a story of the way that geography became a tool for control in very, very powerful way. And finally, I think in a context where we're all wondering where the China-India relationship is going, I think having that longue durée, that sort of longer term perspective on just how difficult it is actually to try to gain control and to try to maintain, authority over a space like the Himalayas, that's something that the book will really enlighten you about, I would say. And finally, I would say it's an absolutely riveting read. And I think one thing that really has me in awe of you, Kyle, is just your use of sources. You know, it's not just Ladakhi, which in itself is it's also Urdu, obviously there's English, but the access to multiple sources is absolutely essential for a multilingual region like the Himalayas. And this is not something that anyone can do. In fact, I would say very few people can do it, and you did it. This is sort of my spiel to really convince you, if you still needed to, that you need to really buy and read this book. But I guess I don't want to speak and lecture you much further. I'd really like to have a conversation with Kyle. And before we go into the book itself, I thought my first question was going to be actually precisely about this present moment that we're thinking of, because I suspect our audience is thinking of that as well. So I was wondering, Kyle, if you could really tell us why, in your view, it's really important to pay attention to this, the past of the Himalayas, if we want to understand what's happening today.
Well, thank you very much, Bérénice. And honestly, I couldn't do a better job of selling the book than that. So I should probably keep my responses short and let you do most of the talking on this, because that was really a very, very kind and generous overview of what the book attempts to do. In terms of why we should really focus on the past, there are I would say, you know, at least two kind of central problems that often get overlooked when we're thinking about the contemporary rivalry. One is that this was that the ongoing claims that are being made by both sides are rooted in a set of contradictory and often imprecise historical descriptions and documents and maps and things like that. And so because there are historical claims being made, it's important to pay attention to how those claims actually came about and the processes and practices that produced them. And secondly, because there is a long, complicated relationship here that goes back much further than 1947 and 1949 with the birth of the Republic of India and the People's Republic of China. So I think, I mean, obviously the historians in the audience will agree with this point, but to, I think, everyone out there, it is certainly important to pay close attention to the history of this. Now, that said, the resolution of any border dispute is not going to necessarily rely particularly on an adjudication of the historical sources. Historical sources can be messy and incomplete, and so certainly a solution won't necessarily be found in the history, but better attention to it is, I think, crucial in this process.
Mm. Yes, I would absolutely agree. And by the way, the region that I'm more familiar with, the Eastern Himalayas, is the other border that's disputed. And so that's very much in line with what I found studying that region. But, you know, one reason I'm mentioning that is that I think one thing that's really important as well is, beyond the historical sources, to really understand the sort of spaces, not just physical, but also human landscapes that we're actually looking at. You really actually brilliantly insist in the book on the politics of what I might call placemaking, how a place is made and the way we conceptualize this, the way as a result this influences how people cross it, live through it, maybe suffer in it. And you insist on the fact that colonial times are a really important moment of transformation for Ladakh. You mentioned in particular how Ladakh underwent a very long, protracted and messy transformation from a trans-regional entrepôt between the inner Asian, Central Asian and Southern Asian spaces into an increasingly marginalized borderland of empire. And at the same time, you always insist on the lived reality and the rich history and imaginations that people in Ladakh have of their own region. And this is obviously, this richness of your account, I think, is really rooted in your own experience of living there, if I'm not mistaken, I remember listening to you telling me about actually survived, was it a whole winter in Ladakh, which if anyone knows how cold it gets, I think survival might be the right, especially for somebody who's never done it, might be the word. So I was wondering whether you could tell me and tell everyone else in the room about Ladakh and how you encountered that region for the first time. Because if I'm not mistaken, this was a passion for Ladakh that started before the PhD. You didn't come to Ladakh because of the PhD, but rather the PhD is something that came out of your interaction with Ladakh.
Absolutely. So I first visited Ladakh in 2005, actually at the end of a Tibetan studies study abroad program, which itself was an unusual introduction to South Asia, given that it really was sort of a periphery first introduction. And so the first thing I did, and I suspect some of the historians and scholars attending might appreciate this, but one of the first things I did when I arrived in Leh and was kind of slowly acclimatizing to the elevation, the base elevation there is around 11,000 feet. But I went and sought out a bookstore, and one of the first books that I picked up was by a historian by the name of Nawang Tsering Shakspo. And when I asked the clerk at the store about him, he said, "Oh, his office is just down the street. You should go say hi." So that really began a friendship that helped, I think, really draw me into the world of Ladakhi history and in Ladakh, and we have maintained a very sort of close relationship over the years, and I returned to Ladakh to help him compile a cultural history, and that was during that very long winter that I spent there. But in doing so, and I think to really the genesis of the book, that first trip to Ladakh really sort of presented this incredible sort of historical paradox, which was reading about Ladakh's past. It was very clear, as you noted, that this was a crossroads of trade to Central Asia, Kashgar and Yarkand, to Tibet, to Kashmir, to Afghanistan, to the plains of India. And yet the first impression that a visitor gets to Ladakh is of the isolated nature of it, the highly militarized space that it has become, because it now finds itself at the nexus of disputed borders between India and Pakistan on one side and India and China on the other. And so the question of how Ladakh became a disputed borderland was really kind of the animating question for the book and for subsequent research trips.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about the history, specifying a little bit more the history of Ladakh before the British arrived on the scene? Because I think one thing that was quite interesting in your book is that to some extent, you wear this slightly in the book, but it seemed to me that you were also saying that Ladakh is a place that has been subjected to attempts at control that could be quite brutal from empires other than the British. And the one that really stands out here before the British was the Sikh Empire in the early and mid 19th century. So I was wondering whether you could tell us, place this British attempt to control Ladakh in the perspective of other empires in history being interested in this crossroads of Ladakh.
Absolutely. So Ladakh, going back really nearly a millennium, has been kind of at the nexus of expanding and contracting empires, and really has played a role as a nexus, as an entrepôt. But particularly with respect to the Sikh Empire in the early 19th century, one of the reason, in fact, that Ladakh became incorporated into Jammu, what would become the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, was because partly out of concerns of the growing British Empire, the Raja of Jammu, which was a vassal to the Sikh Empire, actually sent a military expedition to invade in the 1830s, largely to control the trade routes that ran through Ladakh, and in particular because Ladakh was a conduit of very high value pasham wool used to make pashmina scarves and sweaters and textiles in the Kashmir Valley. And so the very reason why, and then to fast forward a decade, Ladakh was then incorporated into the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir when the Sikh Empire was defeated by the East India Company in 1846, and that sort of appended Ladakh to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and has sort of subsequently led to the various kind of complicated politics that took place in that, really up until 2019, when the state of Jammu and Kashmir was bifurcated into two union territories directly controlled by Delhi.
Yes, so again, we're seeing many attempts at sort of placing Ladakh in its right political context almost, and whether this latest one since 2019 will work out, and from whose perspective is still, I think, well, the jury's still out on this one. Now, focusing really on this British colonial enterprise that really the book is centrally preoccupied with, how, this process is one that, as you correctly and convincingly argue, is one that cannot be reduced to just one moment or one form of rule. You talk about road building, you talk about the gathering and the systematization of information, you talk about demarcating the border, which is often the first thing we think about when we think of the Himalayas and attempts of control. Where does the border lay? But in a sense, that's only part of the story and maybe not the one that was most immediately thought about by the British. And lots of other things. But where your book goes further than other books that have other works that have insisted on road building in this part of the Himalayas, like Chad Haynes, is that you're also stressing that all these very material practices, these things you do on the ground, cannot be divorced from what you might call frontier thinking. That first of all, the frontier of Ladakh for the British is also in the mind. That it's a way of seeing and of envisioning things, of envisioning Ladakh as a place, of envisioning what a border is, envisioning what role a mountain or a watershed plays in that border. And so in a way, what you're saying is that as much as a place where things are done, the frontier is also something that is seen as much as acted upon. And this to me seems quite an important aspect of your book that really adds to the discussion a lot of scholars are having about what is actually a frontier, including as perhaps a space that is exceptional in the sense that it is something that's quite distinct from other places. One of the things that I thought was extremely exciting when I read about this was the way you really unpack the science of geography and the sort of conception of knowledge that underpins geographical science. You particularly talk about the ways that physical geography and its practical pendant, the surveys of India, became the sort of the alpha and the omega of knowing places like Ladakh. It was quite interesting to me that you really showed, for example, how the gazetteers that are the sort of like tiny encyclopedias that British colonial rulers would put out regularly about a region. So you might often have them for different administrative jurisdictions that they put out. It had never occurred to me that actually the fact that the first thing they always start with is geography, right? And we don't question it, at least I didn't. And reading your book, I realized actually the fact that they start with physical geography, the mountains are there, that's how they look, that's where the passes are, is actually a way of seeing that sort of corners a place and prevents it from maybe assuming another dimension. So I wonder whether you could tell us more about that story about geography that you're pushing, that you're putting forward in the book.
Yeah, so besides being a a history of the colonial encounter between British and Ladakh. The two other things that I hope the book does, really to show the colonial backstory to the border dispute through the actual practices and ideas that produced the border, but also to show this much broader transformation thinking that really is a hallmark of the modern world, and that is the role that borders have taken in terms of shaping territory and states, and this is something that is so natural that in some sense we overlook. Borders are ubiquitous. They are they are the lines that shape our world. But this was not always the case. And one of the things that I hope the book does is to show, through analyzing these different practices of frontier and border making, that what was at play, apart from material things like surveying and creating maps and building roads and putting together those manuals of governance, like gazetteers and these official reference manuals, was also a transformation in how geography and the geographic sciences were being used to think about political space. And so, and this eventually, by the end of the 19th century, becomes kind of subsumed under a category that we now know as geopolitics. And what that term really reflects is a causal relationship between geography and politics. And so what we see through all of this sort of close attention to borders and the idea of developing what were called boundary making principles, using sometimes natural, sometimes artificial objects to define them. What we're seeing is a real sort of revolution in thinking about space. And so the historical notion of political territory in Ladakh, as the name Ladakh signifies, that is the land of passes, was one where borders were generally thought of as points along trade routes, that a mountain pass would suffice in terms of signaling territorial control, from moving from, say, Kashmir into Ladakh. The Zoji Pass sufficed as that marker. But when the British come in, they demand a different kind of notion of territory, one which requires that lines noted on maps, which become increasingly sort of official and eventually restricted documents, that this is the official tool for signifying territorial control. And so in the process, they develop all of these boundary making principles. And of course, what better laboratory for experimenting on boundary making than, and particularly using sort of natural objects, than the Himalaya, the world's largest mountains, and long, described by many as a wall. Iqbal famously in a poem calls it the Diwar-e Hindustan, the wall of India. But of course, it gets more complicated than that when you get to regions like Oxide Chin, which topographically does not afford, a neat line of mountains attached to the watershed, which is, as I detail in one of my chapters, is one of the primary boundary making rationales that the British employ in mountainous regions. And as you know, in the Northeast, also generated complications and ambiguities.
Thank you for that. And thank you for mentioning the way that for Ladakhis themselves, actually, the idea of the frontiers line was really alien. And I would probably have more questions to ask about this, to understand how these indigenous notions of space and place differed, actually. But I know that I can see that questions are coming in, and I don't want to take all the space. So I guess my follow-up question would actually precisely for you to unpack this concept of watershed, including because this is language that to anyone who's following the India-China relationship today comes back again and again. Just recently, whether on Twitter or in op-eds, you see, well, the idea that the watershed is somehow a guideline that could feature in a scenario of resolution of the border still comes back from time to time. And yet what you really show is that the more you look for it, the more either you won't find it. In some cases, you purely won't find it, as in the case of the Aksai Chin, or you will create other problems. So could you tell us a little bit about that problem, that Gordian knot of the watershed, if I can call it like that?
Absolutely. So one of the, unlike the Northwest frontier that Ben's work has focused on in the Northeast, that your first book focused on, much of the Himalayan region was really viewed by the British to be peaceful and a sort of self-evident boundary because of the sheer size of the mountain range, and so because of that, from that very moment that I mentioned earlier in 1846, when the British created the state of Jammu and Kashmir, they sent out at first a fairly small boundary commission led by Alexander Cunningham, who would later go on to found the Archaeological Survey of India, and their task was to, in the words of the Governor General who sent them out there, to find a suitable line, boundary line to lay down in an area unlikely to come under much, what was the phrase? I don't remember the exact phrase, but unlikely to come under much attention, sort of ironically enough. And of course, this was particularly focused on the notion of the water parting. And so what that was looking for that line. So, sorry, to back up for a second, the watershed kind of reflected this notion of water systems that really comes out of late 18th and early 19th century geographical science and the emergence of hydrology and geomorphology to think about not just a river, a body of water, but water systems together. Similarly with mountains, not just a mountain, but a mountain range and a mountain system. And so the watershed, as an idea that combines both water systems and mountain systems, seemed like a scientifically precise solution to creating a natural boundary. And so you figure you have a line of mountains and the water falls on one side and parts one side and the other. And if you find that line, then you can identify that as the natural boundary, with the added bonus that because the mountains are very big, they're not likely to have much trouble there. And of course, none of the colonial officers, I suspect, foresaw that, fast forward a century, there would be soldiers on the Siachen Glacier, for instance. But so when the boundary commissioners were sent to Ladakh, they really focused on defining and locating this water parting and using that as the boundary of the eastern boundary of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. That proved to be more difficult, and what we see is a real cycle of very much kind of attention and neglect over the decades, where the British, through whether it's because a Scottish trader gets murdered on the Karakoram Pass and suddenly they have to figure out, oh, is that within our jurisdiction or not? Or a map proves to show mountains on it that don't actually exist. Various episodes come up that push the British to realize that they haven't actually defined this boundary, but the rationale for it is very much rooted in the watershed. Now that works in some places better than others, and much of the Himalayan range does afford a neater water parting, but that was certainly not the case in Aksai Chin, and as you know, was not always the case in the northeastern Himalaya.
Yes, absolutely. And it strikes me listening to you that water has a way of confounding any border makers in the in South Asia, whether you're talking about the Himalayas and the impossible watershed, or you're talking about the India-Bangladesh border, where you have rivers that like to change their course or flood a good part of the countryside. So I see that for the discussion very soon, we'll actually have very appropriately a question on water from Professor Johnson. So I'm looking forward to that. But if I may occupy the terrain for a little bit more, no pun intended, you mentioned how they kept struggling, and what I thought was quite interesting in the book was also the way that, if we're thinking for a second, because we still should as historians, I think, from the perspective of these colonial officials, they have this constant mixture of obsession with finding a border, but at the same time stumbling repeatedly, and in the end resigning themselves or perhaps being okay with the ambiguity. How would you explain this, and how would you explain the fact that this sort of would you say that this sort of okay, we're looking for it, but in the end, if it doesn't happen, let's just live with that? Do you think there's a big difference with the way that post-colonial states like independent India or the PRC live with these tricky, messy borders?
Absolutely, and I think one of the key distinctions, and really a temporal boundary that exists here, is the difference in the acceptance of ambiguity of the colonial frontier and the national border. This is the colonial frontier. Really, I think is often the site of anxieties. And actually, one of the reasons that I titled the book "The Frontier Complex" was because, in addition to the composite nature of frontier making practices that I look at, there's also this sort of psychological dimension of frontiers, the sort of irrational fixation on the frontier and the concerns about it. And so there is kind of a complex and sort of the psychological sense at work too. But the ambiguity that the borderlessness in certain parts of British India generated, that could be tolerated by the colonial state. But it's another thing when you cross into 1947 and Indian independence. The Indian state cannot tolerate that degree of ambiguity. And of course, we have to note that India at its birth goes through one of the most violent, traumatic events of the 20th century, partition, where we have the largest population transfer in human history. Something like 10 million people cross these borders that the Radcliffe Commission sketched out in 6 weeks. And so the territorial bounds of the nation state are something that really that citizens give their life for. And so the notion, there's this patriotic song sung by the famous Indian playback singer Lata Mangeshkar, Aaye Mere Vatan Ke Logon, which describes the sacrifice of the soldiers. She sang this on Republic Day in 1963 and brought Nehru to tears. And the sacrifice, the blood shed on the mountains, that blood was Indian blood. So the geobody, as Tongchai Wenechakul refers to it, is an essential piece of the post-colonial nation state, in a way that the colonial state can deal with that ambiguity, but the nation state can.
Mm. Yes, and I think in that way, really thinking about the legacies of the colonial period and taking them into consideration of post-colonial times is really important, because it also reminds us that there is the violence of placemaking is also epistemic. It's also about ways of knowledge that preclude knowing a place in the way that, in this case, the inhabitants might have engaged with it. And this continues to an important extent in the post-colonial period as well. I will ask just one more question, and this is more to open up and connect your book to other works on the Himalayas, because I'm always really interested to know the way that scholars and authors think of their book as part of a broader conversation. As I've said, 10 or 15 years ago, there was still, by and large, this ahistorical view of the Himalayas, and we've seen through the works of many scholars attempts to really revise this, and I think we're really experiencing a really exciting momentum. In fact, I'm seeing, looking at the attendance list, I see that several people in the room have pioneered this historicization of the Himalayas, including with Arik Moran, who wanted to ask a question. So I was wondering, where do you see connections between your book and other works on the Himalayas? What do you think is changing about the way we understand the Himalayas, thanks to your book, but also other works that you've engaged with and been inspired by?
Yeah, I mean, there is really, I think, this is really an exciting time in terms of scholarship on frontiers and borders. And one of the key pivots, and I would credit Ben's work and your work and many others with really sort of illustrating the shift in thinking about borders and frontiers as objects to borders and frontiers as practices and as a very sort of messy, non-linear kind of historical subject. And and I'm really so excited to see such great work. I mean, South Asia, but elsewhere, and really, I mean, from the work of young scholars like Swati Chawla and Sikkim and Tibet, and Galen Merton on Nepal and China, and of course, I mean, the whole sort of category of border biographies, which is a term that I think Nick McGoran coined for the borders he studies in Central Asia. There's really been a kind of proliferation of wonderful scholarship on this, and I think it really, I mean, it highlights just the centrality of borders in terms of many of the key questions of modern states, and they reflect in a sort of very localized way a lot of key fundamental concerns about states and the ability of states to project power, to control. I mean, in some sense, that is sort of the key, one of the key functions of the state is the ability to, as I say in the book, the ability to impose a line of control is really one of the core tools in the arsenal of the modern state, and the inability to do so is one of the sort of key drivers of insecurity.
Yes. And in this way, I think what your book does as part of this momentum is to really recover and explain the centrality of these supposedly marginal places. I think you've heard enough from me, but certainly not enough from Carl. So I'll hand over to Ben so that we can have questions from the audience. I see they are really coming now, so there's plenty for you to grapple with, Kyle.
Well, thanks so much, Bérénice, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going. I mean, I have tons of my own questions, Kyle, but you can buy me a beer and then I'll ask them to you at some point. And you can buy it off your royalties that no doubt will be extraordinarily expanded from this. Just one quick comment. I also, to give yourself a little bit more kudos, I would actually expand the contribution you're making to that body in the sense that, it's not just borders, it's frontiers, right? And the relationship and distinction between those two. And that's one of the real beauties of your story, is that you give this longitudinal history that talks about the way state forms have conceptualized and performed this space through time and how that changes. And I think that's one of the real central contributions that you offer here. And I do want, in one of my own questions, that I will hold for the moment, because as Bérénice rightly says, you're getting really inundated. But I do want to push you on some of the ways that this might be applicable to other spaces around the world. As Bérénice has said, and I know you don't get a really look at it because you're so focused on the screen, but your comments have just brought up this lively conversation. And I'd also say at this point, that this panel both brings up the benefits and drawbacks of our COVID-enforced online life, because I would love to be doing this in person and congratulating you in person. At the same time, I see old friends and new colleagues on here. Hi, Ornit. I saw you're on there, and Eric Moran, whom I haven't seen for ages, amongst others. You have a strong contingent of Chicagoites that are joining us, something that just wouldn't be possible if we were in person. So it really shows the back and forth of that. And I think that's something we all can probably appreciate. That said, I do want to give the audience some time to interrogate your work some. And what I'm going to try and do is actually, perhaps because you have so many questions, condense them together. And really the first two, I want to give a shout out to Professor Frederick Johnson from your alma mater, Chicago, whom I think you know quite well as Tom Simpson, who we all know quite well. And actually, Tom and I had a wonderful conversation about his work and your work about a month ago through our New Books in Asian Studies launch. And also for anybody interested, that is available on our website if you want to go back and watch that. But they both have questions about the hydropolitics and the environmental aspect of this. And Professor Janssen says, can your approach shed light on flashpoints and hydropolitics of the Himalayas? And I'm thinking Dan Haynes's eyes are now popping in excitement to hear your thoughts on this. And Tom kind of expands on that, asking, I'd be interested in hearing Kyle's take on the temporal dynamics of borders in Ladakh, and what might climate change do to border temporalities in this region? So hydropolitics and border temporalities subject to climate change.
Great. Well, thanks, Tom and Frederick, for those great questions. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also make a plug for Tom's wonderful new book, which does, I think, something that very few books, except perhaps Ben, your latest book, does, which is actually set multiple frontiers in comparison. And Tom looks at the Northwest and Northeast frontiers and really does a phenomenal job of highlighting the kinds of ambiguities and difficulties in terms of both defining and in some sense also controlling the frontier spaces of British India. So a big plug for the frontier in British India by Tom Simpson. So to address the hydropolitics question, there is no doubt that water politics are going to be, I mean, they already are, but will continue to be major drivers of conflict in South Asia and in much of the world. What I would say is the Tibetan Plateau and the greater Himalayan range are home to the headwaters of Asia's 10 largest rivers by volume. They are rivers that indirectly feed nearly half of the world's population. Something like 47% of the world's population is impacted by water coming off the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalaya. And so the specter of intensifying climate change and the rivalries, particularly between India and China, who do not have a water sharing agreement like India and Pakistan do. I mean, India and Pakistan's the Indus Water Treaty, which Dan Haynes knows very well, survived 3 wars between the two of them, and quite recently, in fact, I think just in the last couple of weeks, has been the subject of renewed talks between India and Pakistan. So, water sharing is a major issue. Now, with climate change and intensifying climate change, I think we really are going to see the specter of regions potentially becoming uninhabitable, as I think there has been a short-term increase as glaciers recede in sort of surges of water. But as we look ahead, and this will vary depending on location, as we look ahead, the high desert regions like Aksai Chin, like Ladakh, that are so dependent on glacial melt for the agriculture that is produced in their valleys, may potentially lose that. And I think the specter of climate change in the Himalayas is potentially catastrophic, and will certainly be a major driver of future conflict, and especially so in the Northeast, where we have the Brahmaputra, or in Tibet, the Yarlung Tsangpo, which, I mean, only I think in the last 2 months, it was announced in China's latest 5-year plan that several run-of-river dams were going to be constructed, which of course is potentially impacting not just India, but also Bangladesh, the 2 downstream neighbors.
Great. We have a trio of questions that I think really complement each other, from Tom Timberg here in DC, Eric Moran in Israel, and our very own Eric Schlusel, who works on Western China. And they're all really about local players and the local history. Tom asks if you could maybe talk about the history of the immediate neighbors, like what is the involvement of Chinese, Hunza, or Chitralis in Ladakh. Eric asks if you could maybe talk a little bit about the transformations of Ladakhi society over time. You mentioned about the advent of Dogra rule in Ladakh. What are the changes and continuities that Dogra rule and then subsequently the advent of British rule have on that, and the influence of a consolidating Tibetan state to the north? And then finally, Eric was particularly interested about your engagement with local Ladakhis, and he's wondering if you could say more about your engagement with sources by the people who lived and worked in Ladakh, in both Ladakhi and other languages. And also, kind of to go back where you started, if you could maybe say anything about your personal interactions with scholars from the region.
Yeah, thanks for all those questions, and apologies in advance for no doubt failing to do justice to any of them. But to try to sort of wrap those up as best I can. One of the things that the book attempts to do is really showcase how, through the colonial encounter, Ladakh was in some sense a new kind of Ladakh was formed. Not that there wasn't a political entity known as Ladakh that existed beforehand, but that the territory that the British attempted to shape, and through and the Maharajas, government of Jammu and Kashmir, attempted to kind of craft a different kind of territory. And partly that was because Ladakh, though, as I mentioned, having long-standing understandings of border points, also because of its nexus as a crossroads of so much trade from Central Asia and Tibet, it had long established relationships with these neighboring polities, and some of which took the form of tribute missions. There was a tribute mission, a triennial tribute mission known as the Lopchak, that went back to a treaty in 1684 that established a reciprocal trade sort of tribute mission between Lhasa and Leh. So a lot of, and this produced all sorts of kind of anxieties for the British, who insisted on various tribute being paid to them, but worried that this would undermine notions of British sovereignty. In terms of kind of Ladakh as a political entity, central Ladakh, that which we think of really sort of centered around the upper Indus Valley, really had very sort of fluctuating political relations with its neighboring regions, both in the immediate vicinity, if we think of Zanskar to the south, Nubra to the north, and the Central Asian polities, and over in Gilgit, Baltistan, Hunza, that area, but throughout really the last certainly 500 years, has maintained very active trade and kind of political ties, whether it was occasionally with intermarriage or simply through the traffic of precious goods and whatnot. So the transformation of Ladakh that the British really kind of imposed was one of, in some sense, defining the territory, but also restricting some of these more reciprocal political ties. I'm blanking on the rest of the questions for that. So what I would say is, sources. That's right. So the historical records for Ladakh are principally consolidated into the Ladakh Gyalrab, the Royal Chronicles of Ladakh, which goes up until kind of the late 19th century, and that that is really sort of the principal record of independent Ladakh and pre-colonial Ladakh. There are various religious biographies, hagiographies called Namtar, that discuss some of the sort of more prominent historical figures. But in terms of my engagement with Ladakhi scholars, certainly, I mean, there are a handful of really very prominent Ladakhi scholars, one of whom passed away this past fall, Tashi Rabgas, at I think the age of 93, and they've been really central to telling the stories. Now, my dear friend Nawang, also very much part of this revival of Ladakhi history that we've seen in the last few decades. So there is a rich group of local historians and some young scholars coming up through JNU and Delhi University too, in particular, who are doing some really fascinating work, and frankly getting at sources that I can't. I mean, I could, while I can translate a historical chronicle, I'm not linguistically equipped to deal with some of the more complex literary records and things like that I simply can't do justice to. So we'll rely on more competent scholars to do that sort of work.
Great. Elizabeth Chatterjee from Chicago asked a really interesting question about the role of technology. And how do you see technological change influencing the frontier complex? Does the age of satellites, for example, alter the confounding ambiguity faced in 1962? Which I think is actually a really interesting question, because I think of my own area of the Northwest and the Afghan-Pakistan frontier and the failed promise of technology. I mean, the American military thinking that they have a panoptical view of the frontier because of drones. And I wonder if, either of the Sino-Indian actors on this frontier might fall into that. So what really are the, perils and opportunities that technological change has opened up for this frontier complex?
So, and thanks, Liz, for that question. So first, I think to address some of the continuities, the technological continuities, we still see today some of the practices that developed in the colonial era still very much at play in the technologies being employed. Though the machinery might be different, but the basic practices are the same. So surveying and production of maps, road building in particular. Roads have become really a fundamental. And in fact, I mean, one of the sort of likely causes of last year's real prolonged tension along the border was the completion by India of an all-weather road to one of their advanced points near the Karakoram Pass. Roads are still very, very much as a sort of technology of border making, still very much at play there, and the restriction of information about the frontier is very much at play. So maps, and in fact, this is one reason where for friends and colleagues in India, why they're going to have to wait a little longer to get a copy of my book is the local South Asian edition has to comply with Indian map requirements that restrict the reproduction of maps that fail to show the borders that India claims. So, maps are still very much a regulated tool or regulated technology for articulating border. What has changed, of course, and I think the notion of satellites is a fantastic one here, because we see through satellite imagery that, for instance, the nice, neat ring of mountains that William Johnston sketched in his 1865 map, which formed one of the major lines, the Johnson line, as it was called, one of the major claim lines for a border in the Oxide Chin, insisted on a ring of mountains which satellite imagery shows do not exist. The Oxide Chin is topographically just a lot more complicated than the map suggested. And so satellite technology has certainly helped in terms of maybe complicating things. But it also has, frankly, been one of the few independent sources that we have to watch the ongoing border dispute, precisely because these areas are so restricted and off limits. So in that too, I mean, I know CSIS had done some really interesting work on analyzing satellite imagery, particularly around Doklam, the trijunction of India, Bhutan, and China, and some of the road building and build up there. So satellite technology is certainly one aspect which is really, I think, revealing new insights and has in terms of the border, though it's perhaps only complicating things.
It would be great to get you and Tom Simpson in discussion on this, because of your focus, both how both of you focus on issues of technology and border making. Sonika Gupta has an interesting question, which is expanded by a number of our audience members. She asked, how would you compare the Colonial Boundary Commission's production of territoriality with the recent Indian reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir? So a kind of comparison of the colonial and the post-colonial state. And if I can expand on that question, a number of our other audience members have asked if you could also compare the colonial conceptions of space and territoriality to those of local polities inhabiting this area, whether it be Ladakhi or Dogra or whomever.
Yeah, so those are two big questions for only a few minutes, and I'm not sure if I can address them succinctly in a minute or two. But so to the point about the reorg, one of the things that had been a long-standing call, particularly by the Buddhist inhabitants of Ladakh, was for greater parity with the other regions of the now erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. And so Union territory status was, I think, at least for the Buddhist majority in Ladakh, long sought and desired, in part, and in part, that claim does draw upon sort of earlier colonial conceptions of organizing territories along linguistic or particularly ethnic lines. And so part of the challenge of the whole history of Jammu and Kashmir is you have this composite princely state ruled by a Hindu majority that the British had empowered over a Hindu minority ruling over a Muslim majority, but also with this large this Buddhist population in Ladakh, which geographically was also very distinct. So in some sense, it is a kind of I would hasten to say that it's necessarily a colonial logic, but there's certainly some sort of continuity there. And in terms of conceptions of space, one of the things that I outlined in my first chapter is how the ways of conceiving of space by indigenous populations are more pluralistic than the sort of imperial powers. So I described this by kind of breaking at 4 different what I call modes of seeing. So thinking about space materially, politically, linguistically, and I think most interestingly, cosmologically. So thinking about how Ladakhis viewed themselves as part of a larger sort of cosmogeography that included Tibet. And there is a fascinating story of kind of territorialization of Tibet that it goes back to Tibet's founding and or rather the importation of Buddhism to Tibet and the subduing of a demoness who sort of pinned down by a series of Buddhist temples that sort of creates the kind of Tibetan Buddhist world, and this conveniently enough draws in a lot of the greater sort of Tibetan Buddhist regions like Ladakh and Bhutan and others, but certainly the indigenous ways of seeing were much more pluralistic than the British saw. They came in and they primarily saw things from a political mode, which was define the territory, put a border around it, and call it a day. Whereas that did not particularly work with a much more sort of pluralistic way of seeing indigenous space.
Yeah, I think that resonates with anybody that's worked on indigenous sensibilities of space and territoriality, especially around the limits of the South Asian subcontinent. Well, I see that we're up to time. To those of you in the audience whose questions we were not able to get to, I apologize. It's a statement of the incredible interest that Kyle's book has generated. I would encourage any of you with follow-up questions or comments to feel free to reach out to Kyle. knowing Kyle for as long as I have, I know he doesn't bite. So he's definitely somebody who'd love to engage. But before I let you go, Kyle, I do have to ask one more thing, and that is, what's next? What are you working on now?
That's a good question. You know, actually, since we touched on water politics, I would say water politics is something that I have long been fascinated by and is really tied to borders. So I think more work in that direction. I also have kind of a sort of a niche little side project on the history of remoteness as a concept, and thinking about sort of how can we write histories of distance and space. That's more sort of in the academic variety, or in the academic bucket. But I think thinking about how water plays into borders, and also something that my day job has really kind of got me interested in, is thinking also about how data nationalism and trade and the kinds of articulations of international business relations, especially between India and China, are being sort of refracted through the border. So basically, anything borders is of interest to me and continues to be so. But hopefully that will crystallize in something publishable before too long.
Great, and that's so interesting because it also kind of brings us back to Bérénice, whose own project right now is on water, though a slightly larger body in the form of the Indian Ocean. But well, that brings us to time. Sadly, I think I need to let everyone go now. But again, for those of you listening from afar, The Frontier Complex by Kyle Gardner. There is a discount code on our website that I encourage all of you to use multiple times. And also from the very lively Q&A chat we had going on, we will have a winner that we send out our book for. So please keep your eyes out for that. And then finally, I need to advertise our next New Books in Asian Studies event, which is next month for April, actually the middle of April, April 13th, I believe. And we're going to have Wasma Azma from Temple University, who's going to talk about the media landscape in Afghanistan. So again, that's April 13th, and details for that can be found on our website soon. Again, Kyle, Bérénice, from opposite corners of the world, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to see and talk to you both. I wish I could take you out for a drink afterwards. Well, maybe not a drink, it is 10 o'clock in the morning here in DC, so a coffee. But best of luck, and we look forward to reading the new work on water.
Thank you both so much, and thank you all so much for attending. I really appreciate it, and apologies for not getting to all the questions. I look forward to actually reading them after this, and thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you most of all to Kyle.